Okay, so for today, we're transitioning from animistic worldview to polytheistic worldview. And like I think I alluded to in the past, it becomes overwhelming if you're having to deal with supplicating or controlling or entreating all these different spirits. It would just take up so much of our time and mental, emotional, spiritual energy. And I also teach cultural anthropology. And even though I'm trying to give you these world religions perspective from an in-person point of view, I don't, even though I've met animists, I don't know that I've actually met any polytheist, someone that is actually an adherent to the ancient Nordic or Greco-Roman gods or Sumerian or Egyptian gods. Although we do have trends throughout history, like at the turn of this century, there was this huge theosophic society movement where they brought back a lot of the ancient religious symbolism. And if you go to like Encinitas or like where Swami's is, a lot of these people were Rosicrucians, and the Rosicrucians were bringing in some of these old, like the scarab beetles, right? And it was a symbol of eternal life, because the dung beetle in Egypt, um, what it does is it takes its egg and then it wraps it in a ball of dung, and then that little larva, as it grows inside of that tomb of dung, it eats its way out of its prison as it is developing. And then the larva turns into a pupa, the pupa molts, and outside of this sarcophagus of poop emerges an adult beetle. And many people have speculated this is where Egyptians got the idea of the afterlife and embalming and preserving people as they transform into their divine or afterlife state. And I just think this is so interesting. But the Rosicrucians would take the scarab or the dung beetle. Scarab sounds a lot nicer than dung beetle. But they would take this and they'd make jewelry, pendants, amulets, wards against evil, kind of like how Christians might wear a cross. They would wear the scarab as a symbol of resurrection or everlasting life. And so you see these movements. In our lifetime, there's been a Druidic, well, my lifetime at least, a Druidic revivalist movement where you have Druid lodges forming up. I think there's over 400 Druidic lodges in California. I mean, we're not even talking Scotland or Wales or Britain. We're talking over here in the New World even, but the ancestors bringing those things with them. You've probably all heard of the Burning Man. It's kind of a continuation of the Celtic Wicker Man, where you would make an effigy and you would light it on fire and you would fill it full of offerings. Now, on a good year, it might just simply be fruits and vegetables, things from your field. But in a year of drought or famine or plague, kind of like what we're having this year, fruit and vegetables ain't going to cut it. So they would be looking for animal and perhaps even a human sacrifice, because the greater the need, the more precious the gift. And that makes sense, right? If you're a pagan people, you're thinking, what will get the gods' attention? And so sacrificing, especially like a chieftain or a leader of the community, it might be their responsibility to lay down their life for the good of the people. But what's so horrifying is how they would do this, because they would put the fruits and vegetables isn't so horrifying to me, but living animals inside of a woven wicker structure, like a cage of wicker. And if you can imagine a human sacrificial person in there, and I don't want to call them a victim, because once again, these were often people willfully giving their lives for the people. Now, sometimes they were victims, they were captives in raids or things, but often they would actually be the leader of the community. And then they would light this thing on fire, and as the offerings are consumed, the plants, animals, and sometimes humans, they believed that would supplicate the gods, and then that would give them good crops or in the plague or in the destruction, whatever was happening. They did a remake of this movie. Actually, they did two remakes. The second one was with Nicolas Cage, and it's, I don't know, it's a little wacky. If you can watch the earlier one, and it was the guy who played Saruman in the Lord of the Rings. I can't remember that actor's name at the moment, but it was the same actor, famous British actor. I'm just having a old man glitch, and it's so horrifying. They really play it well. And basically, this Somerset Isle off the coast of England has been suffering drought, and their crops aren't growing. And so they try to lure someone from the mainland out that they're going to end up sacrificing for the good of the island. So and it's set in a contemporary 20th century setting. And so here you have, it's a little graphic. So, I mean, with some nudity and stuff. So I'm not necessarily recommending this, but it's really interesting to see paganism in a modern context. And it really is quite horrifying. To see what would be involved in human sacrifice and the worship of these ancient pagan gods. But The Wicker Man, if I could, I mean, I've never really tried to think about, I did meet one of my friends who actually made up her own pantheon. She made up her own deities for the sun, moon, stars, forest, ocean, seas. And my comment to her was, first of all, I didn't understand why she didn't just tap into a pre-existing set, because there's so many to choose from, but she didn't want someone else's. She wanted to make her own. And my only comment to her was, well, that kind of makes you the maker of gods, which puts you in a really powerful position. You're the ones that named them, gave them their qualities, their traits, said what they do. But I certainly wouldn't be praying to a god that I made up. I mean, and that goes back to Protagoras. Oh, that's from my philosophy class. Protagoras was the ancient polytheistic Greek who said, no, it's not that we were made in the image of God, but we made the gods in our image. And we projected ourselves into the heavens. So why should we fear these human projections when it's we are the masters of our own fate and destiny? And he was like the father of humanism, this idea that man is the measure of all things, including the gods. We even get to say which are the good and which are the bad gods, because we are the authority. But that would be humanism, I guess, almost as like, I see it as more of a philosophy, but I guess you could call it a religion too, like the worship of self, or your own ego or your own will becomes the highest good. And to me personally, that would be like the highest form of idolatry. And I would say that's how sin always happens, when we place our will, our desire, over the will of the Creator. And whether you're an animist doing it, a polytheist doing it, or a secular humanist doing it, I think it's idolatry across the board. If your projection, your image, your ego is your highest good or standard, that's a really intimate type of idolatry. You're bringing it to a personal level. Okay, in test one, if you take it, you'll get the hodgepodge of gods, where I've listed different people groups like the Celts, the Germanic people, the Nordic people, the Sumerians, Egyptians. There might even be some Chinese in there, I can't remember. But I've asked you, and then I put qualities like the father of the gods, or the king or queen of the gods, the god of weather, the god of fertility, the god of war. And I simply want you to be able to match on that grid which gods and goddesses go with those attributes or qualities. And that way you kind of get a feel for how common this was throughout human history. How I want to end this section, I want to do two things. The first is I want to show you from an anthropological perspective. And once again, this is more like a scientific perspective, a soft science, cultural anthropology, but nonetheless a science, where they're trying to understand the function and nature of religion and how it's changed through human history. But they're coming at it from a very secular cultural relativism perspective, where they're simply describing it. They're not trying to place value judgment on it. They're not trying to say it's good or bad. They're just observing, saying, this is what appears to have happened throughout history. And this is their observation. And it's basically Darwinian evolution applied to religious studies, which I think is really fascinating. So just like things evolve from simple to complex, that's how they see religion evolving from animism all the way up to secular humanism is what they would see as the highest truth or good. And so the way the journey begins, I wish I had my whiteboard, but I'll just do hand gestures again. So it begins, our oldest archaeological digs and finds all appear to be animistic in nature. Maybe some polytheism, but mostly this animistic idea. And part of why I say that is because in grave sites throughout, especially the American Southwest, in the burial sites, they found people's personal gear, whether that's their bowl or their coffee mugs. They weren't drinking coffee, you know, whatever their mug was, maybe their bow and arrow, maybe even their companion, like a horse, I mean, not a horse, a dog or something like that, or a parrot, might all be in the grave with them. And always this pottery would be broken that was in the graves. And so archaeologists for years were just assuming, oh, it was like a twofer. People were burying the dead, but they were also getting rid of rubbish and trash and broken things. And then someone finally realized this wasn't just like broken dishware or pottery or a dead animal you didn't want to have to dig an extra grave for, but these articles and utensils had been ritualistically killed. And so you might have a bowl, but it would have like a hole punctured in the bottom, which would have released its spirit, because the spirit of that person needs a spirit bowl in the spirit world. They can't use the physical material bowl. They need the spirit of the bowl, right? So you have to free the spirit from their bowl if they're going to have a bowl in the afterlife. Same thing. And I told my nieces and nephews this, that I do need to be buried with my coffee mug, but I don't want them to hear me. But you have to kill him if I'm going to be able to take him to heaven with me. So but the way you would do that is simply to puncture a hole in the bottom of the mug, and then the spirit would be released and travel with you. The same with Fido, right? If you want your best buddy hunting dog with you in the happy hunting grounds, well, you have to release him from his physical frame. And so Fido gets released and his body is put in the grave with yours, but his spirit gets to roam with you in the fields. Did you want to say something, Josiah?
No, it was just...
Okay, I just saw your box light up like Hollywood Squares, so just check it.
I was trying to mute my...
Now, this is very different from the Egyptians, who are polytheistic, and they believed in resurrection of the dead. Not just you're using your spirit bowl or your spirit dog or your spirit horse in the spirit world, but they would put actual food and non-broken artifacts into the pyramids or into the tombs in Egypt, because they believed that person in the sarcophagus was going to be reanimated, resurrected, and brought back to life. That's why they spent so much time preserving the physical body and putting the organs in separate containers, because those were all going to be resurrected, reconstituted. So very different idea of just your body decomposing and going back into the earth. This is more like that dung beetle, where you're actually coming out in a resurrected newness of life, but there's some aspect of that old body that is continuing on. So in the pyramids, you would find unbroken utensils, unbroken chariots. There would be mummified animals, but I think it would be the same idea that those two would resurrect into the afterlife. Any questions, distinctions on that? Okay, so
was there,
go ahead.
Sorry, was there like an incentive, I guess, to like hoard or to like keep all of your material possessions like with you, because it's, you know, you can't take it with you? Well, yes, you can.
Yeah, these people believed you could. And so they would want to be buried with great wealth, but that's part of why the tombs were built also like fortresses, because they didn't want people looting the tombs. And tomb looting has been a favorite occupation for millennia, right? Because people with that worldview are gonna want to be buried with as much that they collected as possible, because they really think they are going to get to use it in the next world. Yeah, good observation. Thank you. Okay, so from this anthropological perspective, I'm going to step out of my trying to be like a polytheist for a moment here. And if from that anthropological perspective, they're seeing it starting very simple. They're seeing animism as a more simple religion. I don't know about that, but we'll give them that for the moment, on this idea that there's lots of spirits. And it makes sense, right? You're a primitive human. You've just come out of being a Homo erectus or Neanderthal or whatever, and now you're on the pathway of modern humanity, but you're still trying to explain stuff like fires and floods and plagues and how babies are born and why things grow, why the thunderheads come and seem to be like living beings, the spirit of the mammoth, whatever that happens to be. You're trying to come up with an explanation for why the world is the way it is. And for many of them, the easiest explanation was the world is full of spirits. These are living things, whether it's thunderheads in the sky or the fish swimming in the creek. These are all living beings. And so we need to have right relationship, and learn how to control and use these other spirits so that we can survive. Well, it's exhausting, like I mentioned, because if everything's alive, everything has a spirit, you have to be aware of your interactions with everything. There are no inanimate objects. Everything has to be dealt with on some level. So instead of dealing with the spirit of the mountain, the spirit of the sky, the spirit of the sea, over time, they began to elevate certain spirits into a deity level, where they weren't just a powerful spirit, they were now called a god, like little g God, one of many gods. And so now you would have like the god of the mountains, or the god lord of the forest, or the god of the oceans. And these were given names, titles, characteristics, often consorts or spouses. They would have children, and their children would be like sub-deities or sub-gods in those realms. And so we have Poseidon or Neptune as lord of the oceans, but then you have all these little sub-gods under them, even in an aquatic sense. And then we have different, like Vulcan, the god of fire, the god of metallurgy, the god of volcanoes. That would be another one. But above all these different gods, we have Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She's also a warrior goddess. We have Mars, the god of war, and Jupiter, right? But we also have Zeus above all the other gods. But he is still one of many. He's not like the Jewish conception of Yahweh, of there being only one God, but Zeus is Lord of the gods. He has all these other gods under him. But even Zeus is not eternal, right? He had a beginning and he could have an end. It's not like the Jewish, Christian, Muslim concept of a deity. It's very different. So in time, however, polytheism makes it easier, because we mentioned if you worship Zeus or Athena, and like the Greeks, I mentioned, they had the polis, the city-state. So each city would have its own patron deity. And you see this a lot in the New Testament and the conflicts the early Christians have with some of these cities and their pagan deities. I mean, Paul was almost put to death in Ephesus because the gospel was starting to cause as more and more people converted to Christianity, less and less people were buying idols that were made to the goddess Diana, Diana of the Ephesians. And so the metal workers, the shopkeepers, the people who were profiting and benefiting off of the goddess of the city were losing income, and they wanted this new cult or this new religion out of their town because it was messing with them. And you'll see that throughout the Mediterranean, where each city will have its own patron deity or deities. And Even the condensed version, a typical first century Roman village had over 10,000 different gods, little g god. I'm not talking spirits. I'm talking spirits that have been elevated to a divine status. You still had over 10K. And so I don't know how much that's supposed to help you. But what's so interesting to me is each of these gods or goddesses had a special thing that they did, and they all had a feast day, a day of the year they were celebrated, and then their devotees would wear like little memorabilia or icons or charms or medallions to show their identification with that local deity, god or goddess. And I think I gave you some examples of how widespread, like the days of the week, those are, and the planets are mostly named after Greco-Roman gods. Some of our days of the week are from our Germanic, Norse, Celtic hybrid of Western culture. But that's so different from the Hebrew days of the week, which are named after the days of creation. And when you think of the pagan holidays, usually have to do with astrological signs, like where we are in the equinoxes and the solstices. Those are the high holy days, right? The winter and the spring equinoxes, those are when the day and night are equal. And then we have the summer solstice and the winter solstice. Summer solstice is the longest day of the year, winter solstice the shortest day of the year. And then the two equinoxes, they're even. And so the Celtic and other pagan calendars, those would be their 4 major quadrants and holy days throughout the years, and some of their major celebrations would go with those. And I already mentioned what some of those were to you in the last class. Eventually, however, polytheism gives way to monotheism. And here I would make it like 2 paths. And so as it goes from animism to polytheism, one branch went monotheistic and the other went pantheistic. But here's the tricky thing, and we haven't got there yet, but when you really understand pantheism, you realize pantheism is a monotheistic religion. Now, the Greek roots are pan, meaning all or the world, and theos, meaning God. So literally, pantheism means all is God or God is all. But that would mean there can only be one God, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be all. He'd be having to share his divinity with another. So pantheism logically is monotheistic. And even though it appears on the surface like there's literally tens of millions of deities, but there's really just one. And we'll save that till we get there. I don't want to try to explain it now. So we go from animism to polytheism to monotheism, but then even monotheism, even in the Bible, goes through different stages, right? So it begins in Genesis with the Spirit of God hovering or brooding across the face of the waters, but then it develops into our God's greater than your God, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at war with the gods of the Egyptians. And the 10 plagues are like a god-off between the God of the Jews and the deities of the Egyptians. And the more you learn about Egyptology, you see the incredible significance of the different plagues and how they were literally targeting specific Egyptian deities and showing that they couldn't even control, like the God of the Nile couldn't even control his own water. But Yahweh could pollute or taint, turn to blood, even the life-giving waters of the Lord of the Nile. And so in Genesis and Exodus, God, this monotheistic God of the Jews, is seen as one among many gods, but being portrayed as the biggest, baddest, best of them all. But then as the scriptures progress, we go from just this raw, powerful, I'm going to take on any other gods sort of character to he's a God of law, and he gives all these commandments and ways to live, and it's because his care for the people. And then God is presented as a shepherd, like and his people are his sheep, and he's overseeing them and guiding them. And then God's presented as like a king, as like a sovereign, not just of the earth, but of the entire cosmos. And then when we get to the New Testament, God is presented as a human, in human form, the suffering servant in the person of Jesus. But then the secular humanists would take it one more step and say, but now we realize we don't need any external deities because we ourselves are God. We are it. We are the end all be all of humanity, starting at animism and evolving to humanism. Any questions, comments on that? Okay, well, I better show this video before I run out of time. I'm going to just put the link on my YouTube channel because I think if you show someone else's video, they might copyright and shut off the sound, and I don't want to lose the sound. So I'm going to stop this recording, but I will put up the link in the, well, you see where to find it now, right? In my playlist. So I may put up the link anyways. I'll put it below this video on my YouTube channel.